And now question 12 from the second formative assessment for economic principles and policy. Okay, and I'll probably do 13 in the same video because 12 should be quick. In the short run, okay, the defining characteristic of the short run as we've defined it is that firms cannot enter or exit the industry. So, in the short run, A, new firms may enter an industry. Incorrect. All right, well, I only asked you for one, but let's check the, sorry, I need to find one that's correct. Select one. Number B, existing firms may change the quantity they are supplying. Yes, yes, they can. Okay, we do allow price changes in the short run, responding to shifts in demand. Supply curve stays fixed because or at least no new firms are entering. Okay, so each firm operates on a certain part of the marginal cost curve, which is the individual firm supply curve, and as price changes, it will supply different amounts. In fact, it will supply the amount, this is the margin on its marginal cost curve, as long as it's above average cost. It will supply the amount, Q, where at that quantity, its marginal cost of producing that last unit is equal to this marginal cost. You know, suppose it was 10, suppose it was 11. Here, the marginal cost of producing however many units this is, could be 6, is 10. Here, the marginal cost of producing 11 units is, sorry, of producing 7 units is 11. So it stops there. Okay, we got our right answer, B. Just quickly check the others. C, price and quantity supplied are absolutely fixed. Well, that seems to, we've just contradicted that. And D, quantity supplied is absolutely fixed. We've just contradicted that. These were not particularly good decoy answers because C and D basically said nearly the same thing. Okay, finally, lucky question 13. And I think that's the last one on this second of formative assessments for chapters 6 through 10. Obviously, selective portions of chapters 6 through 10. We didn't do much of 10. I gave a slightly different discussion of 10 in the handout and in the lecture, and we skipped large chunks of chapters 6 through 9. I just want to give you the basic picture. Okay, which of the following describes the efficient allocation of resources or top-level condition necessary for the overall efficiency, Pareto efficiency, of the economy? Choose one. All right, this was material that is in the handouts related to chapter 10. I emphasized this in the final lecture, that there were 3 types. You could decompose efficiency into 3 things. You have to have 3 types of efficiency for an economy to really be efficient, right? If just a brief, basically we have to be producing as much as we can in the sense that we're on the production possibility frontier. We can't produce more of one without producing less of another. So we shouldn't be here. If this is the PPF, we shouldn't be here, but any of these points meet that criterion. That's the first condition. Produce as much as we can of every good given holding constant every other good in a sense. Second, but that was not called the top level condition. That was called productive efficiency. That was not called efficient allocation of resources. Okay? The second condition was, given what we're producing, it goes to those people who value it. It's the marginal value of there's no way to reallocate those goods such that we could make some better off and some worse off. So some people like liver more than chocolate given the amount they're consuming. It shouldn't be that given the amount that they have, some people say, I would be willing to give up 2 livers for a chocolate. And someone else says, given the amount I have, I'd be willing to give up 2 chocolates for a liver. If that were true, we are not at the top of the mountain, okay? We're not at the optimal point if we can make an improvement. So if you you're talking to someone and say, here I am I at the top of the mountain? Tell me, am I at the top of the mountain? Well, you say, well, listen, look around you, walk in one direction. Are you getting higher? Yeah, I'm getting higher. Okay, then your original point was not at the top of the mountain. If we can make improvements, we are not optimizing. And that similar argument held when we talked about consumer optimization and firms or production optimization. Okay, so if consumers could make exchanges amongst themselves, or for some reason we could reallocate the goods to make we've produced this amount of goods, but we can make some consumers better off without making others worse off, which would be implied if their marginal rates of substitution were different. Then we wouldn't be optimizing. But again, that's not the top level condition. That's not efficient allocation of resources. That is called exchange. That one was called exchange efficiency. Okay, and by the way, that one, so productive efficiency was ensured by basically an efficient market for inputs and firms choosing those production processes in a way to minimize their cost. The exchange efficiency, the exchange efficiency, given what we're producing, people who value it more, people get it who value it the most, or everyone values that last unit the same amount, no opportunity for beneficial exchange. That's ensured either by consumers trading amongst themselves until no more beneficial trades can be made, or just by the idea that there's a simple price for each good, by the way, reflecting the true trade-offs of the economy, simple price for each good, and each consumer is basically choosing to purchase an amount of that good such that the amount they value that last unit of the good is the price. Also, if we think of two goods and budget constraints, given the price ratio, each consumer is setting their marginal rate of substitution equal to the price ratio. And that price ratio, the price of X in terms of Y, the price of X is the same for all consumers. Therefore, every consumer, even if they may have different preferences, these curves may be shaped differently, but at the point they're consuming, presuming they're consuming some of each good, at the point they're consuming, the rate that they're willing to trade off one for another is the same. It's the price ratio. And sort of analogously, the last unit they consume for every consumer is worth the same amount to that consumer, the price of that good. Okay, but those are not the right answer. We're asking about the efficient allocation of resources, the so-called top-level condition. The top-level condition says that we are choosing the point on the production possibility frontier such that we're producing the quote-unquote right mix of goods. We could not shift to a different mix of goods and make some consumers better off without making others worse off. Okay. In other words, what's going to ensure that, and how you can see that, is that given how they're consuming, the rate that consumers would be willing to trade, given this point that they're choosing, the rate that consumers are willing to trade off one unit for another needs to be the same as the rate that the economy could trade off one unit for another. This transformation in the economy is the same as the rate consumers would be willing to give off one for another. If it weren't the case, then the economy could produce let's say more of the X good, less of the Y good, and at a rate different than consumers would be willing to give up. So they could give up less of the Y good than they need and get more of the X good and make themselves better off. Okay, but I'm just asking you about the condition. Okay, not about what ensures it here. So there is no way. Which of the following describes the top level efficient allocation of resources condition? There is no way to reallocate inputs to increase production of one good without reducing production of the other. Okay, as I said, that is necessary for efficiency, but that's a different condition. That's productive efficiency. So A, while it's a necessary condition for efficiency, it's not the efficient allocation of resources, aka top level condition. Second, there was no way to reallocate amongst consumers to make them all better off. As we just discussed, that's basically or to make some better off without others worse off. That's essentially the exchange efficiency condition. And yes, while that's a necessary condition, that is not what we call the top level or efficient allocation of resources condition. Finally, well, not finally, third, there's no way to produce more of one good and less of another good to make all consumers better off, or to make some better off without making others worse off. Okay, that is essentially the efficient allocation of resources condition, right? The idea is that the economy could potentially choose any point along its production possibility frontier, and we need to choose a point where, given the amount that's produced, uh, given the exchange between, or the way that consumers will purchase that good or exchange the good, such that their marginal rates of substitution will equal the price ratio, it needs to be the case, for instance, at this point, it needs to be the case that the consumer's willingness to trade off one for another is also the rate at which the economy could trade off one for another. It's not that we could move towards producing a different amount of each and make, let's say, this consumer better off because he was willing to trade off at a steeper rate than this, um, without making any worse off. So that is the efficient allocation of resources top level condition, essentially. Okay? So C is correct. And finally, not finally, D, no individuals would want to reallocate wealth in a way they deem more fair. Okay, Pareto efficiency basically has little to nothing to do with the distribution. Basically, as we're thinking about it, so far, we're considering consumers don't have fairness preferences anyways. Pareto efficiency does not imply any level of fairness. Pareto efficiency can involve one person getting all of the resources and the other person getting none. We saw that at the corners of the Edgeworth box, if you're interested in the Edgeworth box. And anyways, the idea of reallocating wealth doesn't really have anything to do with this top level condition, which was about producing the right mix of goods. So D, incorrect. E, no firms have increasing marginal costs at the point they are producing. Again, that sounds something having to do with production and not the mix of goods. You could look at it and wonder whether this is a necessary condition of its own, even if it's not the top level condition. I don't know. I would think about that. I think actually it's certainly possible that in an efficient case, the firms do have increasing marginal costs at the point they're producing. Under perfect competition, we have the price sunk to the minimum of their average cost, which was, I guess, the point where average cost crossed their marginal cost. I'm not sure. We could look at that in more detail, whether it had to be flat or increasing, but that's not the point. Okay, so that's it. Just to give you the fine point on it, or to sort of fully explain this, re-explain this, what ensures the top level condition? I haven't been particularly rigorous about it, but the idea of what might ensure that the economy will choose a point on the production possibility frontier such that the rate of trade-off in production is the same as the consumer's willingness to trade off is that the relative prices are sending signals to producers. Producers are saying, okay, consumers are willing to pay P star for this good. Let me as an individual producer produce up to that point where my marginal cost of that quantity is equal to P star. So in other words, it costs me this much to produce this good, and that's P star. And P star comes from, in some way, the willingness of the consumers to trade off one for another, suggesting the demand curve, and the price comes from the intersection of market supply and demand curves. And at this quantity, each firm produces good X at this marginal cost, and if I was to look for a different good, like good Y, they would be whatever the price of Y was, PY, let's call it, PX, whatever the price of Y was, all those firms would be producing at this marginal cost equal to PY. So the cost of production of PX relative to PY will be equal to the prices of PX relative to PY. Consumers' rate of trade-off, willingness to trade off X for Y, reflects the relative prices of Y and X on the budget constraint, right? So it'll be tangent to their indifference curves. So this slope will be the same as the relative prices of producing Y versus X. or the relative costs at the margin of producing y versus x. The relative costs at the margin of producing y versus x essentially tell us the economy's trade-off between producing good y and good x. If y is relatively more costly to x, then we could, by giving up a little bit of y, we can produce a lot more x, and vice versa. Okay, so I hope that gives you some insight, and I think that's the last video I'll post before the exam, so good luck, and if you have any questions, please ask on the VLE's forum for student questions.